Today, I'm going to tell you a story so dangerous it nearly burned the West to the ground. Set deep in the unforgiving frontier, where dust choked the air and silence could kill. This was a land where power wasn't measured by gold, but by water, blood, and who dared to stand alone against a tyrant. It all began with a single letter, a desperate promise of protection, small enough to fit in a woman's pocket, yet strong enough to ignite a war that would decide who truly owned the frontier. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. She stood alone on the packed dirt floor, staring at a man whose boots were barely holding together with a length of frayed twine. Alara Voss had believed she'd traded the choking weight of Boston debt for a quiet life of hardship in the Wyoming territory. She was ready to bolt. She was ready to cry out. What she didn't know was that the scarred hands pouring her morning coffee were the same hands that could sign checks large enough to buy half the frontier. She didn't know that the man pretending to live like a pauper was guarding a secret men had already died trying to steal. And she certainly didn't know that the crumbling shack she already despised was the last line of defense between her and a war that would soon set the West ablaze. This was the tale of a mail-order bride who believed she had married nothing, only to discover she had bound her fate to the most dangerous man on the frontier. Back in Boston, the rain never washed the streets clean. It only made the filth slicker. Alara Voss tugged the collar of her worn coat higher as she moved along Wharf Street's slick cobblestones. The year was 1875, and the financial panic had left the city gasping like a man drowning in shallow water. But for Alara, the suffocation ran deeper. She gripped the folded letter in her pocket as though it were armor. It was the only thing standing between her and Mercer Hale. Hale wasn't a banker. Bankers kept ledgers and business hours. Mercer Hale was a shadow, one that clung to the doorway of her late father's tailor shop. A man who collected debts with a pleasant smile that never reached his lifeless gray eyes. Her father had been dead 3 months now, his heart giving out under the pressure of owing Hale $2,000. A fortune Alara, a seamstress paid in pennies per stitch, could never hope to repay. She turned a corner and stopped cold. Standing beneath the gas lamp outside her boarding house was one of Hale's men, a thick-necked brute named Doran Pike. He leaned against the post, scraping his teeth with a sliver of wood, waiting. Alara didn't hesitate. She spun on her heel, her pulse crashing in her ears like a trapped bird, and darted into the narrow alley leading toward the post office. There was no going back. Not for her clothes. Not even for her mother's locket. She pulled the wrinkled newspaper clipping from her pocket, reading it again beneath the weak alley light. Wanted, wife of sturdy constitution and honest character. Life is harsh. Solitude is complete. I offer shelter and protection. No luxuries promised. Right to Ryland Creed, Blackwater Ridge, Wyoming territory. It was the bleakest proposal she had ever seen. No talk of affection, no soft words, no promise of comfort, only labor and a roof. But one word had caught her eye. Protection. Alara had spent her last savings on a telegraph reply and a third-class train ticket. The letters that followed were brief. Ryland Creed was a man of few words. He'd sent the fare with one instruction only. Come alone. Tell no one. At the station, steam from the locomotive struck her face. The air smelled of coal and freedom. As she boarded, squeezed between Swedish immigrants and a man reeking of stale tobacco, she glanced back at Boston's dark skyline. She was 24 years old, educated. Once she'd dreamed of owning a small dress shop on Newbury Street. Now she was selling her future to a stranger in the middle of nowhere, just to keep her bones unbroken. The journey west blurred together. Brick cities gave way to open farmland, then to endless plains that swallowed the horizon. When the train finally screamed into Cheyenne, Alara felt as though she had shed her old life entirely. Her dress was blackened with soot. Her eyes burned with exhaustion. She stepped onto the wooden platform as the wind tore at her hair. Late October air bit like teeth. "Alara Voss?" The voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding beneath river water. She turned. The man before her was unsettling. Towering well past 6 feet, shoulders broad enough to blot out the afternoon sun. His duster had once been tan, but was now stained with mud and oil. His hat sat low, hiding eyes too dark to read. A thick, untamed beard swallowed half his face, but it was his boots that caught her gaze. The leather was cracked, the soles thin, and one was bound together with twine. This was Ryland Creed. A weight dropped into her stomach. She had expected poor. The letter had warned her. But this man looked ruined, like the land itself had beaten him down and was simply waiting to finish the job. "Mr. Creed?" she asked, her voice barely steady. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He only nodded once. Sharp, final. "Truck, I only have one bag," she said, pointing to the battered valise at her feet. He lifted it easily, as if it weighed nothing. "Wagons are this way." As Alara followed him through Cheyenne's chaos, past roaring saloons, shouting cattlemen, and women laughing from balcony rails, she felt herself shrinking. Everyone around her belonged somewhere, had purpose. She had none. And she was walking straight into the unknown. Ryland Creed guided her past the polished carriages and the solid freight wagons, all the way to the far edge of the yard. There, waiting alone, stood a wagon that looked like it had already survived a small war. The boards were gray with age, splintered and scarred. The horse hitched to it was a massive roan, its hide marked with old cuts and healed wounds, its expression meaner than the man holding the reins. Ryland tossed her bag into the back without effort. He climbed up, the wooden frame creaking beneath his weight, then looked down at her. "You coming?" Alara Voss glanced back toward the town. She could try to stay. She might find work, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, serving meals. But Mercer Hale's reach stretched far beyond Boston, and she had no money for even a single night's lodging. She clenched her jaw, lifted her skirts, and climbed onto the hard bench beside him. "Let's go," she whispered. Ryland snapped the reins. They rode in silence for nearly 4 hours. Wyoming unfolded around them with a beauty that almost hurt to look at. Wide, empty, and utterly indifferent to human survival. They kept going until the sun slid toward the horizon, staining the sky with bruised purple and deep blood-orange light. The quiet between them pressed heavy. Alara studied him from the corner of her eye. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred and split. He handled the wagon with calm skill, yet his posture never softened. He watched the land constantly, eyes shifting from ridgeline to valley, as if expecting something to move. "Is it much farther?" Alara finally asked, her throat dry. "Another hour," Ryland replied. His voice surprised her, clear and controlled, lacking the thick frontier drawl she'd heard in Cheyenne. It was steady, educated. "You wrote that you'd offer a roof," Alara said carefully, trying to pull him into conversation. "Do you raise cattle or crops?" Ryland let out a short sound that might have been a laugh. "Blackwater Ridge won't grow crops," he said. "Too much stone, and there's not enough grass for a herd." Alara frowned. "Then how do you live?" He glanced at her briefly. Beneath the shadow of his hat, his eyes were a striking, unsettling blue. Sharp, thoughtful, guarded. "I get by," he said. "I hunt, I trade some." Her stomach sank. A drifter then, a man living off the land. She had married a squatter. Night had fully settled by the time they left the main trail and turned onto a narrow, rocky path winding into the foothills. The temperature dropped fast. Ilara shivered, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. Without a word, Rylan reached behind the seat and retrieved a heavy wool blanket. He tossed it into her lap. It smelled of smoke and horse, but it was thick and warm. "Thank you," she murmured. He didn't answer. They crested a final rise, and moonlight spilled across a small valley bowl enclosed by jagged cliffs on 3 sides. At its center sat the homestead. Ilara caught her breath. It was a sod house carved directly into the hillside, its front wall built of stacked logs packed with earth. It looked less like a home and more like a bear's den. A crooked lean-to barn clung to one side, sagging under its own weight. A single lantern hung beside the door, swaying in the wind. "This is it," Rylan said, pulling the wagon to a stop. Ilara remained still. In Boston, even the poorest buildings were made of brick. This was dirt. She was going to live in dirt. Rylan climbed down and came around the wagon. For the first time, his movements softened. He placed his hands at her waist to help her down, firm, controlled, respectful. "It isn't much," he said quietly, "but it's safe. No one comes up here," she thought bitterly, because no one would want to. She stepped toward the door. It was made of thick oak, far heavier than the rest of the structure, and secured with a massive iron bolt. Rylan unlocked it and motioned her inside. The interior was a single room. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, giving off the last of its heat. A rough table stood near 2 chairs. At the far end, a bed layered with animal furs rested against the wall. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. It felt bleak. "I'll tend the horse," Rylan said. "There's stew on the stove. Eat." He left her alone. Ilara stood in the center of the room, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "This is my life now," she told herself. "I am Mrs. Rylan Creed, mistress of a hole in the ground." She crossed to the stove and lifted the pot's lid. The scent of venison and sage rose into the air. Warm, rich, unexpectedly good. Her stomach answered at once. She found a tin bowl and spoon and served herself. As she ate, her gaze drifted around the room. It was sparse, but the longer she looked, the more something felt wrong. The table was rough pine, but the chair was mahogany. Old and scarred, yes, but finely crafted. The kind she had seen only in wealthy Boston parlors. It was a finely crafted piece, the sort of furniture Ilara had only ever seen in the grand parlors of Beacon Hill. She lifted her gaze to the shelf above the bed. There were books, real ones. Not only a Bible, but rows of leather-bound volumes worn by use. She rose slowly and crossed the room, her fingers brushing along the spines. The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Principles of Geology by Lyell. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. She drew down a slim volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. It fell open at a page marked by repeated reading. Notes crowded the margins, written in a sharp, angular hand. The ink was dark and rich, quality ink, the kind that did not fade with time. "You like to read?" Ilara startled, nearly dropping the book. Rylan Creed stood in the doorway. He had removed his hat and duster. Without the shadows hiding his face, he appeared younger than she'd expected, perhaps 32. There was something striking about him, rough and dangerous. though exhaustion lay heavy in his eyes. Yes, Alara said quietly. I just didn't expect to find a library here. Rylan crossed to the stove and poured himself coffee from a dented tin pot. Books travel easy, he said. They don't need feeding. He leaned against the wall, sipping slowly, watching her over the rim of the cup. You're disappointed. It wasn't a question. Alara straightened her back. I'm surprised, Mr. Creed. You live like a man with nothing. Yet you read philosophy and sit in a mahogany chair. His eyes narrowed slightly. Leftovers from another life, he said. Don't read more into it than that. She hesitated, then pushed past her fear as frustration rose. And the lock on the door, she said. That bolt belongs on a fortress, not a mudhouse. Who are you afraid of, Rylan? She paused. Or should I be asking, who's afraid of you? He set the cup down. The metal struck the table with a sharp, final sound. Rylan stepped toward her, stopping only a few feet away. The air between them felt tight, compressed. There are wolves in these hills, he said quietly. And things worse than wolves. His gaze held hers. You wanted protection from your debts back in Boston. I'm giving you that. He lowered his voice. But the price is this. You don't ask about my past. Do we have an understanding? Alara looked up at him. She saw the danger, but she saw something else too. Weariness. And beneath it, a sadness that ran deep. As her eyes drifted lower, she noticed what she had missed before. A ring hanging from a chain around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. The lantern caught the metal. Gold, thick and heavy. A wedding band, she whispered. Good, he said shortly. Take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. You don't have to. I do, he said firmly. I didn't bring you here to dishonor you. We'll marry proper when the circuit preacher comes through next week. Until then, the bed's yours. He turned toward the door, lifting his rifle from its hook. Rylan, she said. He paused, hand resting on the latch. Who is Mr. Sterling? His body went still. His knuckles tightened around the rifle stock until they turned white. Slowly, he turned back. Where did you hear that name? I saw it, Alara said, pointing to the inside cover of the Shakespeare book. Property of V. Sterling. Rylan's face hardened into stone. Vaughn Blackmere owns this territory, he said, his voice dropping into a low growl. He's the man who thinks he's a god. He looked at her once more. And if he finds out you're here, God help us both. The door slammed behind him. Alara stood in the silence, the wind screaming against the sod walls. She looked at the book in her hands, then at the massive iron bolt on the door. She wasn't just the wife of a poor settler. She was a piece on a board she didn't yet understand. As she lay down beneath the firs, listening to the night claw at the earth, she realized Rylan Creed wasn't hiding from poverty at all. He was waiting. For something. Dawn did not arrive gently. It struck the sod house like an assault. Sunlight burst through the cracks in the door, scattering dust motes across the cold air. Alara woke with a sharp breath, her body stiff from the unfamiliar bedding. For a moment, she believed she was back in Boston, weighed down by the old fear of debt and hunger. Then she smelled the earth, the dry, honest scent of packed soil, and remembered. She sat up. The room was empty. The heavy iron bolt had been unlatched. Rylan was gone. She rose and wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders. The stove held only glowing embers. She fed it kindling, watching the flames awaken before turning to take in her surroundings by daylight. It looked cleaner than the night before, but no less poor. The floor was hard-packed dirt. The walls were lined with old newspapers, a settler's trick to keep the earth from crumbling inward. The headlines dated back to 1872. Reading them only deepened the feeling that she had stepped not just west, but backward in time. She spotted a folded note resting on the table, held in place by a heavy brass compass. Gone to check the perimeter. Don't leave the valley bowl. Water's in the barrel outside. Check the perimeter, Alara Voss murmured under her breath, the words sounding almost military. She dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, a faded gray calico worn thin at the seams, then stepped outside. The morning air bit with cold and carried the scent of sagebrush and pine. The view stole her breath despite herself. The valley stretched wide and golden, tall grass glowing beneath the rising sun, hemmed in on all sides by granite cliffs that rose like jagged teeth guarding a secret. Yet her gaze drifted immediately toward the barn. It stood nearly 50 yards from the house, leaning hard to one side as if exhausted. The roof was patched with rusted tin and sod, barely holding together. One good wind, she thought, would bring it down. If Ryland Creed was a farmer, his tools would be inside. If he was a hunter, hides might be curing there. Either way, she needed answers. She had to know what kind of life she'd bound herself to. She had to know whether winter would mean hunger. Crossing the yard, her boots crunched over frost-stiff grass. The barn door hung by a single hinge, secured only with a loop of rope. "Hello," she called softly. "Mr. Creed?" No response. She loosened the rope and slipped through the narrow opening. Inside, dim light filtered through gaps in the rotting boards, casting pale stripes across the dirt floor. At first glance, it looked exactly as expected, discarded junk. A rusted plow, broken harness straps, a heap of molding hay slumped in the corner. But Alara was a seamstress. Her entire life had trained her to notice what others overlooked. A crooked stitch, a mismatched button, a hemline off by a hair. And something about this barn felt wrong. The proportions didn't match. From the outside, the structure looked nearly 30 feet deep. Yet the back wall, stacked high with hay bales, sat barely 20 feet in. 10 feet were missing. Unease tugged at her. "Don't ask about the past," he'd warned her. But this wasn't the past. This was her present. She stepped closer. The hay was stacked too neatly, too carefully. She tugged at one bale. It shifted. Behind it wasn't a wooden wall. It was a dark, oil-stained canvas tarp. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She glanced back toward the open doorway. The yard beyond lay silent and empty. She pulled the tarp aside. A door stood hidden behind it. Not a barn door. A reinforced steel door. The kind she'd seen guarding bank vaults back in Boston. Painted black to disappear into shadow, but unmistakable by the heavy iron wheel mounted at its center. "What in God's name?" she whispered. She grasped the wheel and tried to turn it. Locked tight. Her thoughts raced. A vault door in a collapsing barn in the Wyoming territory. Why? What could possibly be hidden here? Gold? Stolen money? Was Ryland Creed a criminal? A bank robber hiding from the law? Her eyes dropped to the ground near the door. The dirt there looked wrong. It wasn't packed earth. It was wooden planking dusted lightly with soil to disguise it. She scuffed it with her boot, brushing the dirt aside. A trap door revealed itself. This one wasn't locked. A simple iron ring lay set into the wood. Alara gripped the ring with both hands and pulled. The door was heavy, counterweighted, and it rose with a smooth, oiled hiss that felt disturbingly unnatural in a place this primitive. Below, a ladder descended into darkness. Not complete darkness. A faint chemical glow pulsed from below. She drew a breath, gathered her skirts, and climbed down. The air changed instantly, cool, dry, carrying the scent of paper, oil, and something sharp like ozone. She reached the bottom and turned. Her breath caught. This was no cellar. It was an office, a command center. The chamber had been carved deep into the earth, its walls reinforced with brick and heavy timber. Kerosene lamps burned low along the sides, casting a steady amber glow. At the center stood a massive drafting table covered in maps. Not crude sketches, but precise topographical surveys spanning the entire territory. They were pinned flat and layered with mathematical markings. The walls were lined not with food or supplies, but with shelves of geological samples. Stones tagged neatly in white labels. Quartzite, pyrite, hematite. In the corner, resting on a solid desk, sat a telegraph machine. A wire climbed the wall and vanished into the ceiling above. Ilara stepped toward the drafting table. Her fingers brushed the surface of the largest map. It depicted Blackwater Ridge and the surrounding county in exacting detail. The map was washed in color. Most of the territory was shaded deep red, marked V. Blackmere. But a narrow blue vein cut straight through the heart of that crimson empire. It began right at Ryland Creed's homestead and wound downward through the valley like a living artery. At the bottom, the legend read, Red. Blackwater Aquifer, primary access point. Beneath it, stamped in bold red ink, were the words, Deed holder, Ryland Creed. Ilara Voss stared. She knew enough about the frontier to understand the truth. Out here, water outweighed gold. Whoever controlled it decided who lived, who farmed, and who survived winter. If Ryland owned the source, he wasn't poor at all. He held the entire valley by the throat. She turned toward the desk. Several ledgers lay stacked neatly. She opened the top one. It wasn't a record of debts. It was a record of offers. May 12th, 1874. Blackmere offers $5,000. Declined, August 4th, 1874. Blackmere offers $10,000. Declined. Her eyes dropped further. September 4th, 1874. Barn burned. Warning shot. She swallowed. October 15th, 1874. Offer $50,000. Declined. $50,000. Ilara's chest tightened. She had nearly sold her entire future for $2,000. Ryland Creed had turned away a fortune fit to build a palace. I told you not to ask questions. The voice came from above. Ilara spun around, clutching the ledger to her chest. Ryland stood at the top of the ladder, his silhouette cutting off the light. A rifle rested loosely in his hand. He wasn't angry. He looked tired. He descended slowly, boots thudding softly against the wood. Passing her, he took the ledger from her grasp and closed it with care. You're not a farmer, Ilara whispered. You're a millionaire. Ryland gave a humorless breath of laughter. I'm a man with a piece of paper that says I'm rich, he said, and a gun to my head that says I die the moment I try to spend it. He moved to the map. I worked as a surveyor for Union Pacific, found the aquifer 5 years ago. His finger traced the blue line. I bought the deed before Von Blackmere knew it existed. He bought every acre around me, thinking he could box me in, thought the water was under his land. Ryland looked at her, his blue eyes sharp and unblinking. When he learned the source was here, everything changed. Blackmere owns the town. He owns the law. If I sell to him, he dams the water, charges the farmers 10 times its worth. and bleeds them dry until he owns their land too. His jaw tightened. I'm the only thing stopping him from turning this territory into his private kingdom. So you live like a pauper, Alara said softly, as understanding settled in. To hide. To survive, Rylan corrected. If I show wealth, I paint a target on my back. If I leave, he takes the land. So I stay. I sit on this rock, and I hold the line. He stepped closer. I needed a wife, Alara. Under the Homestead Act, a married man can file an extension and claim double acreage. It locks the southern ridge. It makes it harder for him to steal it legally. A chill slid through her. So I'm... paperwork. Rylan's expression softened. He lifted his hand as if to touch her face, then thought better of it and let it fall. You're a partner, he said quietly. One I didn't expect. I didn't expect you to be this sharp, or this brave. He exhaled. Get your coat. She blinked. Why? We need supplies, and if we're going to survive this, you need to see the man we're up against. Where are we going? Rylan's eyes hardened. Into the lion's den. The ride to town took nearly 2 hours. The silence in the wagon had changed. It was no longer the unease of strangers. It was the tense quiet of conspirators. Rylan made her change clothes. He had her wear her oldest dress and brushed dust along the hem with his hand. We need to look broken, he told her. Blackmere feeds on weakness. If he thinks we're proud, he strikes. If he thinks we're desperate, he waits for us to collapse. As they crested the final ridge, the town of Blackwater Ridge spread below them, far larger than Alara had expected. 2 main streets crossed the valley floor. To the west stood tents, shanties, and rough timber buildings housing miners and drifters. To the east rose brick storefronts painted white, and dominating the center, elevated like a throne, stood the Blackmere Hotel. 3 stories tall, wrap-around porch, glass windows shipped from the east at ruinous cost. Stay close, Rylan murmured as he guided the horses onto the main street. Don't speak unless spoken to. And whatever you do, don't look Vaughn Blackmere in the eye. The town bustled around them. Riders passed at a trot. Women carried baskets. Wagons creaked under loads of timber. And somewhere within it all, power was watching. But as Rylan Creed's battered wagon rolled through the clamor of the street, the noise seemed to thin. Conversations dipped, heads turned, whispers followed in its wake. Alara Voss felt their stares pressing into her back. They weren't curious. They were afraid. And worse, they were pitying. Rylan guided the wagon to the hitching post outside Hetty Moreland's general store. He climbed down and helped her to the ground. Head down, he murmured. They stepped inside. The air carried the smell of roasted coffee beans, leather, and fresh sawdust. Behind the counter stood the shopkeeper herself, a broad-shouldered woman with sharp eyes. The moment she spotted Rylan, her posture stiffened. Mr. Creed, she said coolly. Didn't expect to see you till next month. Ran low on flour, Rylan replied, slipping into the rough, unpolished drawl he'd used back in Cheyenne. He hunched his shoulders, making himself appear smaller. Brought the wife. Hetty Moreland's gaze slid to Alara. Her eyes swept over the dusty dress, the worn hem, the tired boots. So I heard, she said. Mail order, was it? Alara's mouth tightened. She wanted to answer back, but she remembered Rylan's warning. She lowered her eyes. Yes, ma'am. Hetty sniffed. Well, you'll need the basics. Though your credit's thin, Mr. Creed. Very thin. I've got cash, Rylan muttered, patting his pocket. As they moved through the narrow aisles, lifting sacks of flour, beans, and coffee, anger simmered in Alara's chest. She had seen the gold samples in the bunker. She knew he could buy this entire store 5 times over. Yet here he was, begging for beans. The bell above the door rang. The room cooled instantly. Conversation died mid-sentence. Alara turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway. 2 others flanked him, large men with heavy builds and low-slung holsters. But it was the man between them who commanded the space. He was in his 50s, dressed in a flawless gray suit tailored to perfection. A silver-tipped cane rested in his hand, though he walked without a limp. His hair was swept neatly back, his face handsome, smooth, and utterly predatory. This was Vaughn Blackmere. He surveyed the store like a monarch inspecting his court. Then his eyes found Rylan. A slow smile curved his lips. "Well now," Blackmere said, his voice slick as oiled silk, "if it isn't the Hermit of the Hills." He strode forward. The tap of his cane against the floorboards was the only sound left in the room. Rylan didn't fully turn. He kept his head lowered. "Mr. Blackmere," the man drawled, "I hear you fetched yourself a bride." Blackmere stopped only a few feet away. His gaze slid to Alara. It felt like being touched, greasy, invasive. "City girl," he mused. "Boston, by the look of her." Alara remained silent. "She's got spirit," Blackmere said softly. "Or maybe she's mute." He tilted his head. "Which is it?" "She's shy," Rylan said quickly, stepping just enough to block Alara from view. "We're only here for supplies, Mr. Blackmere. We don't want trouble." Blackmere laughed, a short, barking sound without warmth. "Trouble?" he said. "Rylan Creed, you are the trouble." He stepped closer, invading Rylan's space. "You're a stain on progress, a tick clinging to a thoroughbred." His smile sharpened. "My offer still stands, 50,000. He glanced pointedly at Rylan's boots. "That's a fine sum for a man held together with twine. You could take that pretty wife of yours to San Francisco. Buy her silk instead of this." He gestured loosely at Alara's dust-stained dress. Rylan's hands curled at his sides. Alara saw the tendons tighten. She felt the violence rolling off him, barely contained. He wanted to kill this man. But Rylan forced his fingers open. "I like my land, Mr. Blackmere," he said evenly. "It's home." Blackmere's smile turned thin. "It's a grave," he hissed, "and sooner or later you'll fall into it." Then his attention shifted back to Alara. He reached out, and before Rylan could stop him, lifted her chin with the tip of his gloved finger. "You're a pretty little thing," Blackmere murmured. "When you get tired of starving up there in the dirt, come see me at the hotel. I've got a suite, bathtub, hot water." Rylan moved, just a fraction, a tightening of his shoulders. But instantly, the 2 Blackmere riders behind their master dropped their hands to their pistols. Alara saw it clearly. If Rylan drew, he would die. Right here between sacks of flour. She jerked her chin free of Blackmere's touch. "I prefer the dirt," she said. Her voice was steady, sharp, unmistakably Boston. "It's cleaner." The store fell into a deadly hush. Hetty Moreland gasped behind the counter. Vaughn Blackmere stared at Alara. For a heartbeat, true anger flashed in his eyes. Then his lips curved into a soft chuckle. "Cleaner," he repeated thoughtfully. "We'll see how clean you feel once the snow sets in, my dear. We'll see." He tipped his hat toward Ryland Creed in mocking farewell. "Tick-tock, Creed. The railroad's coming in the spring. I want that water rights deed before the first rail is laid." His smile sharpened. "Or I'll pry it from your cold, dead hands." He turned on his heel and strode out, the Blackmere riders falling in behind him. Only then did Alara realize she'd been holding her breath. Her knees trembled beneath her. Ryland caught her arm, gripping hard. "Pay," he said to the counter. "Now." He tossed a coin across the wood. It wasn't copper. It was a heavy gold eagle. $20. Hetty Moreland stared at the coin, then at Ryland's ragged coat. Her eyes narrowed. "Keep the change," Ryland growled. He seized the sack of flour and pushed Alara toward the door, moving fast. Outside, he threw the supplies into the wagon. "You shouldn't have spoken," he hissed. "He touched me," Alara said, her voice shaking. "I wasn't going to let him treat me like one of his women." Ryland climbed onto the seat and hauled her up beside him. "He was baiting me," he said sharply. "He wanted me to draw. If I had, his men would have shot me in self-defense. And by morning, he'd own the land legally. That's how Blackmere works." He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, fleeing the town. "He's a monster," Alara said. "He's a businessman," Ryland replied grimly. "And he's running out of patience. The railroad's coming. That changes everything. That's his deadline." Ryland glanced at her, his face pale. "And now he's noticed you. He knows you're not just some quiet farm girl. He knows you've got fire. That makes you a target." Alara swallowed. "What do we do?" Ryland looked toward the mountains where storm clouds were gathering thick and dark. "We stop hiding," he said. "If he wants a war, then we give him one. But we can't fight him alone." "Who?" Alara asked. "Everyone in that town is scared of him." "Not everyone," Ryland said. "There's a man, an old friend. He runs the freight line out of Laramie." He hesitated. "Silas." Then he shook his head once. "No, not Silas." He corrected himself quietly. "Dutch Van Doren. He hates Blackmere almost as much as I do." Ryland reached beneath the seat and pulled out a canvas-wrapped bundle. He unfolded it carefully. A gleaming Winchester lever action caught the light. He placed it in her hands. "If he won't help," Ryland said, "then you'd better learn how to use that." The season's first snow did not fall gently on Blackwater Ridge. It arrived like a fist. The wind screamed through the canyons, tearing the last leaves from the cottonwoods and burying the valley beneath a blinding white sheet. Inside the sod house, the air turned grim. For 3 days straight, Ryland drilled Alara. This was not the tenderness of newlyweds. It was soldiers' training. "Again," Ryland ordered, standing in the cutting wind behind the house. Alara raised the Winchester. Her shoulder burned purple with bruises from recoil. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. Still, she didn't complain. She sighted the empty tin can balanced atop the fence post 50 yards out. "Breath in," Ryland said. "Breath out. Squeeze." Crack. The can flew apart, spinning through the air with a jagged hole torn clean through it. "Good," Ryland grunted. No praise, only confirmation. "Reload." Walking backward, eyes up. Her hands fumbled at the lever, shaking from cold and fatigue. "Do you really think he'll come this soon?" she asked. "In weather like this?" Ryland scanned the ridgeline, squinting against the snow's glare. Blackmere's arrogant, but he's not stupid. He knows the snow traps us. He knows no one can reach this valley once the drifts deepen. If he's going to move, it'll be before the passes close. He paused. He'll want it to look like an accident. A fire in winter. Tragic. He took the rifle from her, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment, the tension eased. Ryland studied her then, truly studied her. The exhaustion in her eyes, the iron in her jaw. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This isn't the life you were promised." Alara Voss rubbed her aching shoulder. The letter had warned her, hard work and no luxuries. "You didn't lie, Ryland," she said quietly. "You just forgot to mention the war." "I have money," Ryland Creed said suddenly. "In the bunker. There's a safe behind the map rack." He met her eyes. "There's enough gold in there to get you to Paris. If this goes bad, you take the tunnel. It opens a quarter-mile down the creek bed. You take the gold, you take the horse, and you don't look back." Alara stiffened. "I ran from one debt in Boston, Ryland. I'm not running again." He opened his mouth to argue. Snap. The sound cut through the night like a blade. It wasn't a deer. It was too heavy. "Inside," Ryland whispered. "Now." They moved fast, slamming the heavy oak door shut. Ryland snuffed the lantern, plunging the room into dim gray light, broken only by the stove's glowing embers. He pressed to the shutter, peering through the narrow crack. "How many?" Alara breathed, gripping the Winchester. "5, he murmured. "Riders coming up the creek bed to mask the sound." He turned sharply toward her. "They're not here to talk. Go to the trap door. Get into the bunker. Lock it from below." "No," Alara said. She worked the rifle lever with a hard snap. "I'm staying." "Alara!" Crash! A bottle smashed through the small window, exploding against the far wall. The stench of kerosene flooded the room. A heartbeat later, a burning rag landed in the spreading oil. Whoosh! Flames leapt up the newspaper-lined walls. "Fire!" Ryland shouted. He grabbed a wool blanket and beat at the blaze, but the oil had soaked deep into dry earth and paper. Smoke thickened instantly, bitter, choking. "Come out, Creed," a voice shouted from outside. It wasn't Von Blackmere's smooth drawl. It was rough, drunken, eager. "Come out and burn." Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the front wall, splinters sprayed across the room. "We can't stay." Ryland coughed, eyes streaming. "The roof will cave in." "The bunker!" Alara shouted. "No time," he snapped. "If we open it now, they'll see. They'll find everything." He grabbed his coat and rifle. "I'm going out the front. I'll pull them toward the rocks. You go out the back window. Run for the barn ruins. Hide in the hay." "You'll be killed." He shoved her toward the rear. Ryland kicked the front door open and dove into the snow, rolling hard. 3 rapid shots cracked through the night. Bang, bang, bang. One rider dropped instantly. "He's out! Get him!" someone shouted. Alara scrambled through the back window, tearing her dress as she fell into freezing mud behind the house. Shouts echoed. Hooves thundered. Gunfire split the darkness. She didn't run for the barn. She ran along the side of the burning house. From the corner, she saw Ryland crouched behind the water barrel, pinned by 3 riders circling wide. A 4th man dismounted and approached the blazing doorway, torch in hand, intent on finishing it. Alara raised the Winchester. She remembered the lesson. Breath out. She aimed not at the rider, but at the man with the torch. Crack. The bullet tore into his leg. He screamed, dropping the torch into the snow. The riders spun in confusion. "Flanked! He's got help!" Ryland used the moment. He rose fully into view and fired with terrifying precision. One rider collapsed. Another's horse reared violently, throwing its rider hard. The remaining 2 men broke. This was no execution. This was a fight. They turned their horses and fled down the valley, swallowed by darkness. "Ilara!" Ryland's voice was raw. She ran to him. He was slumped against the water barrel, one hand clamped to his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark, steaming in the cold air. "I'm here," she cried, dropping to her knees. "Oh God, you're hit." "Just a graze," he lied through clenched teeth. His face was ashen. "Help me," he whispered. "To the barn. To the bunker." Behind them, the sod house was fully ablaze. Flames roared skyward, lighting the night like a signal fire. A beacon visible to every soul in the valley. Fear should have broken her. But instead, it hardened Ilara Voss to iron. She dragged Ryland Creed across the snow-choked yard, hauling him through the shattered barn door and down to the hidden trapdoor. Getting him onto the ladder was agony. He slipped halfway down, crying out as his strength failed, crashing hard onto the bunker floor below. Ilara slammed the hatch shut and spun the locking wheel until it clicked into place. The roar of fire and the shriek of wind vanished instantly, replaced by the low humming silence of the underground fortress. She rushed to him, tearing open his coat. The bullet had torn into his side just above the hip. It wasn't fatal, but the blood loss was frightening. "Medical kit," Ryland groaned, pointing weakly toward a steel box bolted to the wall. "Whiskey. In the desk." For the next hour, Ilara was no seamstress. She was a field medic. She cleaned the wound, stitched torn flesh with steady hands. Needlework finally finding its darkest purpose, and bound him tightly. Ryland lost consciousness halfway through the pain. When he finally slipped into a fevered sleep, Ilara washed the blood from her hands in a basin of icy water. She stood slowly and looked around the bunker. Their home above ground was gone. They were buried beneath the earth. Von Blackmere would believe them dead for at least a day, maybe 2. Ilara crossed to the telegraph machine in the corner. Ryland had spoken a name before drifting into unconsciousness. Silas North. She didn't know the codes. She didn't know the procedures. But beside the machine sat a small notebook labeled Cipher. Inside were dense strings of alphanumeric patterns. Yet on the final page, written plainly, was a single line. Emergency contact. Laramie Freight. Ilara sat down. She had never worked a telegraph key before, but she knew the rhythm from newspaper columns. Tap, tap, clumsy, slow, SOSBLACKWATERHOLDDOWN. She waited. Nothing. She sent it again, and again. For nearly an hour she tapped her message into silence. Then the machine clicked. The ticker strip shuddered and began to move. RECEIVED WHOISTHIS. Her breath caught. She tapped back. HISWIFE. A pause. Then the machine rattled violently. JOLDFAST SILASISROLLING. Ilara sagged back into the chair. She looked at Ryland sleeping on the cot, her husband pale but breathing. "The cavalry's coming," she whispered. 2 days passed in the subterranean gloom. While Ryland battled fever from the gunshot wound, Ilara became something else entirely. She pored over ledgers and maps, piecing together the truth hidden beneath years of silence. Ryland hadn't merely protected water rights. Under the alias J.H. Holdings, he had quietly purchased Union Pacific stock for years. He hadn't been hiding. He had been waiting. The southern rail route through their valley would destroy Von Blackmere's northern land investments overnight. Blackmere wasn't just greedy. He was leveraged to the bone and terrified of bankruptcy. "You're squeezing him," Alara murmured, studying the geological surveys. "If the railroad board sees these maps, they'll vote for your route. Blackmere will be ruined." "That's the plan," Rylan rasped from the cot. "But desperation makes men burn the world. He'll tear everything apart to find those maps." 3 measured knocks echoed suddenly on the hatch above them. Not Blackmere. The cavalry. Silas North descended the ladder first, followed by 2 men straining under the weight of a heavy crate. Inside rested a carriage-mounted Gatling gun. "Blackmere thinks you're dead," Silas grunted, gripping Ryland's hand. "Town's already celebrating." "Let them," Alara said quietly. "We need the original surveys at the railhead before tonight's supply train leaves. It's the only legal way to finish this." "The roads are watched," Silas warned. "No wagon will pass." "Then we take the river," Alara said without hesitation. "The rapids are dangerous, but open. It's the one route he won't guard." Ryland tried to rise, pain tearing through his side. "I'm going." "You can't even walk," Alara said firmly. She wrapped the maps in oilskin and strapped the tube across her back. "I'll take the skiff. I'll deliver the proof to the conductor." She turned to Silas. "You're coming with me." Then she faced her husband. "Can you hold the bunker?" Ryland glanced at the Gatling gun, then at his wife. No longer a frightened seamstress, but a commander forged by fire. "I can hold the line," he said. "Go." They dragged the logging skiff into the freezing, churning waters of the Blackwater River. As Alara and Silas pushed into the violent current, the first thunderous roar of the Gatling gun echoed from the ridge behind them, a declaration to the valley that the war had begun. Ryland Creed was drawing the enemy's fire. Now it was up to Alara Voss to strike at the heart of von Blackmere's empire. The river run became a blur of ice, spray, and raw terror. Silas North wrestled the skiff through the savage rapids, grinding it onto the bank just as the Union Pacific number 119 began to pull forward. Alara didn't hesitate. Soaked to the bone and half frozen, she leapt onto the moving locomotive, forcing her way through steam and noise. She slammed the oilskin-wrapped tube into the stunned conductor's hands. "Get these to the board in Cheyenne tonight," she shouted over the whistle. "They'll save the company millions." The train thundered eastward, carrying the proof that would shatter Blackmere forever. Back at the ridge, Ryland Creed stood with his back to the bunker wall, down to his final cartridge. Blackmere's riders had closed in from all sides. Just as von Blackmere raised his cane and ordered the final assault, the earth trembled, not from dynamite, but from hooves. Alara returned at the head of a column of Iron Veil deputies. "It's over, Vaughn," she called, swinging down from her horse. "The board voted an hour ago. They chose the southern route." She held his gaze without flinching. "Your land is worthless, and the bank has already called your loans." Blackmere's face collapsed as the truth hit him. With a snarl of desperation, he raised his cane gun. A marshal's shot shattered it from his hand. As von Blackmere was dragged away in chains, screaming at a kingdom that no longer belonged to him, Ryland staggered from the bunker, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Alara caught him before he fell. And there, amid the smoking ruins and ash of the war they had survived, Ryland finally slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger. 3 years later, the sod hut was gone, replaced by a white timber home overlooking a thriving rail town. Alara Voss had come west expecting hunger and hardship. Instead, she found a partner, a purpose, and a fight worth winning. She hadn't married a poor farmer. She had helped build an empire. Alara Voss proved that in the Wild West, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a revolver. It was a woman with a plan. She saved her husband, toppled a tyrant, and secured a legacy that would echo across generations. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.